because what I'm going to be talking about is based on, I won't say speculation, but it's kind of weak inference. And my thoughts about evolving social political complexity came about from the 10 to 15 years or so of battlefield archaeology, specifically related to the Pequot War. So what I would really like at the end of this talk is critique. I don't mean like critique, like polite critique. I want you to like eviscerate me, okay? So we'll start out with talking about conflict archaeology, the sort of method theory of that. We'll talk about the battlefields of the Pequot War for context. Because we're going to be talking about a particular early contact period, Pequot War Era domestic site, we're going to be talking generally about early 17th century Pequot domestic sites. Then we'll evolve into, is a prelude to talking about this particular site, Calluna Hill, we call it. We'll talk about evolving Pequot social, political, and military complexity on a regional scale. But then how does this like operational, how do we operationalize this? How do we see this? Is there a manifestation at the household level or the village level? And that's where we're at now. And it's only because we have found several quite remarkable domestic sites, villages, that date between 1611 or 12, the beginning of the Dutch arrival in trade and the end of the Pequot War of 1637, because of the presence of domestic, trade objects. Pretty narrow time frame. So these sites, and one in particular, may have a real opportunity for us to begin to address issues related to this that we've never had the opportunity before. So with that, we'll get started. I just want to mention our best friends and the people who've supported us, the American Battlefield Protection Program. We've gotten more than a dozen grants from them over the last 15 years, who've really funded, all this research. And it started out as sort of battlefield archaeology, but we distinguish between battlefield archaeology and conflict archaeology. And what I'm going to be really talking about tonight is more conflict archaeology. The battlefield archaeology is kind of where we started, documenting the battlefields of the Pequot War. But what I really want to point out is, conflict archaeology examines the long-term evolution of societies in a potentially conflict context that exists in a changing context of war. So it looks at war as a fundamental cause of societal change, especially the rise in socio-political complexity. And those of us who have read anything about chiefdoms or emergent chiefdoms or incipient chiefdoms know that militaristic aspects of their evolution are critical. And I think that's what we're seeing here. So here are the battlefields that we have looked at. Mistick Fort, the one in particular we'll be talking about tonight will be Battle of the English Withdrawal, and the domestic sites we found during those investigations. We've done Saybrook Fort, we've done battles, Fairfield Swamp Fight. All of those, however, based on the primary sources and based on the archaeology, it really informed us, me, of, evolving Pequot social political complexity, particularly military complexity. And that's a key, I think, to one avenue of understanding the evolving social and political complexity of the Pequot. So this is the Battle of the English Withdrawal. Many of you have probably heard me talk about this before. Here's the Mistick Fort on the right. But what very few people know is that following the Mistick Battle or Mistick Massacre, English fought a 10-hour, 6.5-mile fighting retreat to the middle of Pequot country, which we have documented. And, definitely the most intense battle of the 17th century. We've recovered thousands of battle-related objects. Without going into detail, between the fighting men lost at Mistick and the fighting men lost on the Battle of Withdrawal, numbering combined at 500 men, it broke the back of the Pequot military, and that's primarily why they abandoned to fight the English and their Narragansett, Mohegan, and Pequot allies. So here's some of the stuff we get on, battle-related objects. It's pretty amazing. We've understood a lot about Pequot military tactics, weapons, as well as English, which has helped inform us of all this. We've also uncovered a lot of native battle-related objects. And this is kind of interesting. I mean, we are seeing for the first time, I think ever, what native men, Pequot, Narragansett, Wangunk, and Mohegan, the allies, are bringing into battle with them. We've never had an opportunity to see this before, and it's pretty interesting. Not only the obvious weapons, I just want to point out, one of the objects in the lower right, it says, a mortise axe. The Pequots are reprocessing a lot of trade axes and not using them as axes. They are reforming them into traditional celt forms that, we are as archaeologists familiar with, that have been present for thousands of years in native domestic context. I think a lot of them are weapons of war, but we're seeing other things, amulets, what native men are bringing a lot of cuprous objects, particularly if they're red, into the battlefield in pouches, we think, and that's another context we won't go into here, but so it's been pretty interesting. The brass points on the left are also interesting because the top row, they're very unique. They are conical rolled points that there's only one place you find these, one origin, and that's in the middle Connecticut River Valley. From Weathersfield north to Deerfield, and they are associated with the Wangunk and their linguistic kin, that the Pecumtuck, extending up to the Pecumtuck. They're the only people who make and use those projectiles. And knowing that there are Wangunk warriors, soldiers in this particular battle, we can spot their presence on the battlefield in various locations. The rest, we've got a sense of the stylistic variability and who they might be associated with, but again, it's kind of weak. The three to the left and the second row on the left, those are all recovered from the Pequot fort. A couple of them are bent, indicating that they either hit in English armor, English buff coat. And we know in one case from John Mason's narrative of the Pequot War, particularly the Battle of Mistick, he mentions that lieutenants. There's a lot of variability that we've been able to connect with particular native combatants on the battlefield. Top row, Wangunk, Middle Connecticut Valley. The three in the second row left are Pequot. And others, we can associate with Narragansett. The rest are kind of tentative. Don't really know. So this is the Withdrawal battle. And these are the domestic sites that we have investigated. And 5973 Calluna Hill is in the upper right. So one of the way we found these, and we did not expect them, these domestic sites at all. If you noticed from this slide, the route is kind of, wanders, meanders. we finally figured out that what they're doing, they have a lot of wounded. They're carrying them on stretchers, et cetera, et cetera. They're following the path of least resistance. And what that means is they're following existing paths or trails, Pequot paths or trails. And those paths and trails happen to connect Pequot villages and other sites. Maybe not at the time of the battle, except 5973, and we think maybe 59-111. And that's why we found these things. So underlying the battlefield stuff were all these domestic artifacts. And here's the evidence was largely because of, I wouldn't call these brass scrap, but like throwaway stuff, but they are reprocessing a lot of objects. So here are those domestic sites along the retreat that are the signatures or cuprous materials in various ways. So just think about this for a second, okay? These are Pequot sites that have European trade objects. That means they would date between the arrival of the Dutch, 1611 or 12, and when the Pequots abandoned their territory because of the Pequot War in 1637, 23 years. All right, so we have 6 sites that represent a portion of a Pequot settlement pattern, settlement system within a 23-year time frame. Pretty remarkable when you think about it, to have that specificity in terms of time period. What we'd really like to do is seriate those into first half or second half of that 23-year time period based upon English objects or Dutch. English really only began to trade with the Pequots in the last 3 or 4 years of that 1633 to 37. And we're doing some interesting things to sort of pursue that. So the chronology we have, as I just mentioned, is the Dutch are trading with the Pequots for 25 years, 23 years. English for only 30 years. So in theory, we should be able to identify early Pequot settlements with the predominance of Dutch material culture. Well, of course, a lot of these guys that are sharing that material culture, particularly beads. So the chronological aspects are very challenging. We're still working on them. We're looking right now at trace elements using scanning electron microscopes and XRF analysis to see if we can sort of figure this out. The radiocarbonates, we've dated, we've got a dozen radiocarbon dates. They don't tell us anything. They're always 1640 plus or minus 20. So they don't help. So it's going to be based on material culture. This is the kind of stuff that we are finding. So these 6 domestic sites have yielded an amazing array of trade goods, like unprecedented. You only find these things in burial sites. No one's ever found these in domestic sites, and we're finding them. Mattocks, the upper left, are very common. Reprocessed axes. So here's Pynchon's trading inventory, 1635, and we find all this stuff. It's pretty amazing correlation. I would say all of the iron objects, except maybe that pot hook on the right, have been reprocessed. The axes are cut up, and you know what they're doing with them? They are making celts out of them. These axes, Biscayne axes, are just too freaking heavy. They're unwieldy. And by Biscayne axes, I mean an axe produced in the Bay of Biscayne. They have a unique maker's mark, and they were considered the best, forged axe in the world at the time. And, the French, the Dutch, the English are all trading them. But we don't find them whole. We find them cut up. and reformed. These two at the top have not yet been completed, we don't think, but they're being reformed into traditional cells. So that gives you just a sense of the incredible array of trade goods and the potential for looking at examining a variety of topics that we won't go into tonight. But in the context of these investigations, spending a decade or more on investigating Pequot, any available source, primary source, I began to get the sense that we were looking at something kind of unique in terms of, Pequot social, political, and military complexity. And I began to think about, and this is where I wouldn't say I'm in the world of speculation, but maybe weak inference. I began to think that what we might be looking at among the Pequot, and they're not unique, I think in Narragansett, we're in this trajectory, and perhaps the Wampanoag. We're looking at an evolving complexity of social political complexity. But my perspective is looking at this from the context of evolving military complexity. I don't have the data that's specific to the social political aspects, but I think I do in the military components. So we're looking at, one of those criteria is sustained conflict, regional conflict, and in that context, permanent fortifications. So once you begin to fortify villages, and we know the Pequots had some, and in the upper right, you see the Pequot village was attacked at Mistick, and contrast that with, the image of that round village in at the bottom, which is, for North Carolina, but actually Native people used circular forts up until the Pequot War, when they shifted to, square forts with bastions. But, permanent, when you begin to fortify a village, it indicates you are anticipating regular conflict, attacks at any time. Trauma, there's plenty of that. I ask you to look at the image on the lower right. That is a conical projectile point embedded in the vertebrae of a Pequot male found in a burial where the U.S. subbase now is. And we have found several of these in the context of burials, several meaning three. I shouldn't, but they're all clearly caused the death of these individuals or a coup de grace. It also indicates an extra regional conflict, because the only people who are associated with those conical points are the Wangunk speakers, from Wethersfield, north. So we have plenty of that. In fact, I would say that, I know there's this kind of a myth that pre-contact Southern New England was a very friendly place, not a lot of conflict. Not the case. So there's precedent for this incessant warfare we see in the 17th century. And I did definitely not a really great study in the sense of, evidence, but I looked at all the reports of burials and Connecticut bulletins and Long Island bulletins, New York bulletins, and of all the burials, 120 or so, I found that 15% exhibited death by trauma, and that's obvious. Now, keep in mind, these people who are reporting these, they're not professional archaeologists, but when they describe missing heads, or they describe projectiles embedded in bone, when they describe other things, it's pretty obvious. So that 15% is probably underrepresented. That's high. And these are late woodland sites. That's really high. And of those 15%, 6% were women and children. So that suggests there's a high degree of intense conflict, sustained conflict before the 17th century. So, but the 17th century seems to be different, and we'll talk about that a little bit. So iconography, and I'll go back to this, but you see that image of sort of a celt-like looking axe in the middle of the slide. That's a monolithic stone axe, and the Yukon collections we'll talk about, but that's part of this iconography. Those types of objects are only found with warrior elites in Mississippian societies. You see in the lower left, maces, axes, things of that nature. So weapons, frontiers. So one of the things you look for as evidence of sustained conflict is empty space, frontiers. And we see this in southern New England between the Pawcatuck River and Weekapaug, Rhode Island. You know, there's no sites that have ever been reported from the 17th century. There's, you know, or at least from that Pequot War Era. We know it's an area that was fought over by the Narragansetts and Pequots incessantly. In fact, there's one reference that, you know, the Narragansett Niantic Fort at Niantic Charlestown, Ninigret's Fort, was there as a front, to protect them as a frontier against the Pequots. And the fact that there's empty space, that's a very common response of populations to, you know, vacate warring areas. So one thing I want to contrast is, you know, tribal warfare versus more warfare associated with complex societies. I'm not saying chiefdom, I'm saying maybe emergent or incipient, but, you know, tribal warfare is kin-based, it's for prestige, retaliation, very limited number of combatants, limited goals and objectives, certainly not territorial, limited number of deaths. You know, it's kind of a raid, counter-raid sort of conflict. That is not what you see associated with complex societies, where you have allies and tributaries warring for territorial control. The goals and objectives are regional in scope. Subjugation and tributary systems are part of that. That is what we see with the Pequot. We do not see evidence of, you know, tribal warfare. So I don't expect you to read all this stuff, but so the Pequot, an emerging chiefdom. You know, on the left, my argument is basically based on militaristic arguments. You know, militaristic chiefdoms are expansionists, which the Pequots were, territorial conquest, subjugation, exaction of tribute. So if you look at the quotes on the right, which is, you know, just a half dozen of many, it's pretty clear the Pequots were expansionists. It's pretty clear that they are attempting territorial control, and it's probably about control of wampum production and dissemination and choke points where the furs were. It's real clear by, you know, numerous sources the Pequots were expansionists, and they, over a 10 to 15-year period, they subjugated their neighbors to control the territory along the entire Connecticut coastline and eastern Long Island. So here's sort of a, you know, cartoonish model of that, but here's Pequot territory in blue. And, you know, you can see the battles that took place. Mohegan territory, we don't know actually when that took place, but it did happen. We see southwestern Rhode Island, we see eastern Long Island, we see Connecticut Valley and down, you know, or the Connecticut coastline down to Fairfield. And then we see the Connecticut Valley, 3 battles. And if you took the time to read the, you know, the previous slide, the first, you know, quote there, it was the Pequots fought 3 battles against the Wongung for control of the middle Connecticut Valley, with the agreement that, you know, whoever won those battles would control the Connecticut Valley. That is not tribal warfare by any stretch of the imagination. That is not tribal warfare. That is expansionist for control of territory and tribute and subjugation. So one of the pieces of evidence, weak though it might be, for this extra-regional warfare is, are the types of brass points or weapons. In the upper left, you see these kind of unique conical points that we only find in domestic sites between, like Wethersfield north of Deerfield. That's actually correlates with the linguistic boundary of that particular group of native people. Interestingly, the only time we find those conical points in Pequot territory is in burials of adult men in context that suggests they have been killed or a coup de grace. And on the Pequot War battlefields, we have found these in interesting context. And we know that Wangunk from the Wethersfield, Hartford area accompanied the English contingent of native allies. The only points we find in southern New England are these flat conical points. So, and here's, kind of a, identification, if you will, of Pequot allies and tributaries. And I have to say, those allies and tributaries, some were subjugated, some were allies, some were allies based on intermarriage, but this seems to be the lineup, if you will. So, for example, I always thought this was very interesting. The Pequots 200 Pequots conducted a raid on Wethersfield during the war, which actually led to the declaration of war by Connecticut, which directly led to the attack on the Mistick Fort. But among the men who attacked Wethersfield in April 23rd, 1637, were Quinnipiac and Sasquatch. So that to me is very, very telling of a larger confederation and obligations perhaps from these tributaries to provide men for warfare and other things. The other thing we see is a change in settlement patterns. So here's the frontier, the blank space, but the two forts, Mistick and Weinschauks, they're not only occupied by the chief Pequot sachems, but which suggests a political hierarchy and a settlement hierarchy. They are situated on the summits of large hills with commanding views where we have never found late woodland sites, villages, or sites of any kind. That suggests a change in settlement patterns for a couple of reasons. One, the presence of permanent fortifications. Two, they're occupied by the chief Pequot sachems. And, third, there are just a pretty dramatic shift in settlement patterns. This is pretty much what I just said. These are the sites that we know about, the dates of the 17th century. Take it for, what it's worth. We're still figuring this out. But based on the 6 domestic sites we have, we're kind of inspired to find more. And really, we think we have an opportunity to really begin to understand Pequot settlement systems. The articulation of sites across the landscape in terms of movements, in terms of numbers of people, temporary, permanent sites, et cetera. So the other aspect of this warfare is the development of wartime iconography. So we mentioned that warrior elites on the left. We see this monolithic stone axe, and the object on the right is kind of interesting. It was picked up. It's in the American Indian Archaeological Institute. It's a head for a club, but it's a really unique material, and that is at Weinschauks, which is the seat of Saskis. One wonders. It's a pretty unique type of material and a pretty unique kind of weapon. We find some interesting iconography at the Mistick Fort, that's the steatite figurine at the lower left, who has this stance of a sachem, very sort of regal bearing, if I can use that term. And then, you know, brass and Jesuit rings seem to be associated with men on the battlefield, which is pretty interesting. So here's this object. So this object, we believe, is associated, it seems to be associated with the Pequot War and, you know, the Pequots. It was found in a place called Sachem's Head in Guilford. The context is mildly suggestive of the Pequot War, but the iconography is freaking amazing. And the only places these monolithic stone axes are found, I think there's one found in Lake Champlain. All the others are found in Mississippian, you know, burial sites associated with warrior elites. And it's very interesting iconography. You can see that. And it mimics a celt hafted into a wooden handle, which all of these monolithic stone axes do. Facing you in the upper left is an owl, harbinger of death. That's coming at the person being attacked, if you will. The opposite side in the lower right is the face of a person. There is a bird of prey at the bottom now, and it's also inlaid on both sides as we've done the analysis with shell. Not quite sure what kind of shell yet. And we also see vermilion. You can see in the lower right, this orange stuff, that's vermilion, a very bright red, as you can see in the background here on the curtain. And the eyes of the owl also have that shell. So when this was dressed, it was a very, formidable expression, I think, of power of elites. So now let's turn to this site, Calluna Hill, that we have been investigating for a number of years. We'll be back there this summer, and it's turned out to be a really, really remarkable site. It's never been plowed. We know the date in which it was occupied, or at least when it was destroyed. And what we're interested here, there appears to be 7 domestic areas with associated household middens. And we're looking at household variability. So if you consider the fact that, I'm making an argument for evolving or emerging Pequot social political complexity, how does that manifest itself at the level of the household? It should in these villages. And well, I can cite you a number of, lines of avenues of evidence or research, So this is what we're looking at. Do we seeing differential, specialization in production? And we think we are. There's differences in food remains. Is it significant, relevant? Is there evidence of status, rank? Now keep in mind, this is a small village. This is probably only 7 structures, we think. But there's some interesting aspects to it. So we discovered this in 2012 when we were documenting the route of the English withdrawal. And if you can see the top part of that, that's a quote by John Mason, which allowed us to find this site. The English don't talk much about the retreat, withdrawal after Mistick, maybe a few paragraphs compared to pages on Mistick. But he mentions this, and we thought, wow, we kind of know where he was when he stopped it's a stream. Next thing he says is, he fell upon several wigwams and burned them. Could we find it? And we did. Took us a while because we were stupid. We're looking for the village along the route of retreat, and as you can see, it's off to the side on another terrace. But that's the beauty of metal detecting. I would have to say this entire site was defined, and all the middens were found through metal detecting. We test pitted the crap out of this site. Nothing. Metal detecting found everything. Objects, middens, because of the objects in the middens. So just cautionary tale here. If you're looking for 17th century sites, don't dig for them. So here's just a couple of, the eastern half of the site, which is, the eastern half of the site is where we first began our investigations many years ago. And one thing we thought we could get a handle on is Mason said they burned the wigwams. So we did some phosphate testing. And in theory, that should pick up, evidence of high concentrations of organic material, whether it be fertilizer or burning. And we found a bunch of burned areas. Like, wow. Well, curiously, they don't really correlate with a lot. They're in the general area of where we think the domestic sites are, but not quite. So we're not quite sure, but they're in the ballpark. So when we first began our investigations, we found 2 such households and associated household middens. We went back this fall because we wanted to try out some new metal detector technology and new methods. We found 5 more. So since then, we've investigated a couple of those middens and found some pretty interesting stuff. So in 2012 to 16, this is, one of the first areas we kind of got a structure, maybe. These, in the upcoming investigations, we're focusing on 2 things. One, first of all, I should preface that we've done 100% metal detection of the site. And we're pretty confident we got everything. I know that's not a great approach. We always want to leave something, but I just felt we had an opportunity to really learn something about the distribution of objects. And there's some pretty interesting patterns and distributions. What, of course, metal detecting is not going to tell you is non-metal objects, where they are. Ceramics, kaolin, beads, glass, shell, all that kind of stuff. So post holes. So, we have what might be a structure. There's a lot of ceramics with it and some other stuff. So it's kind of interesting. That's one of the things we'll be focusing on this upcoming field season. So we find these concentrations of domestic objects in varying densities, by the way, and in various types of objects. So for example, at F2, which is called feature 2, we find a lot of reprocessed iron objects. At F1, we find a lot of reprocessed brass objects. At F36, we're finding a lot of really interesting reprocessed brass into interesting types of tools. So there's an enormous amount of variability here that we don't yet understand, but that's one thing that we will be endeavoring to do. The other thing I just want to bring to your attention is look at the layout of these sites, these households. They're separated by a lot of empty space. You can see it's sort of shitty. It's like not great area. It's lower. It's a little wet, but there's also a lot of good area in between. I'm wondering about the particular distribution of household locations. Why is this 2 linear patterns? Don't have any explanation, but it's there. And this is the kind of stuff we're finding in this particular site. If you look at these reprocessed cuprous objects, there's a lot of objects here. I mean, a lot of objects, boxes, folding knives, kettles, and many other things. It's amazing what the Pequots are acquiring and what they're reprocessing. The only object that we have found that has not been reprocessed is a pothook. Everything else is reprocessed. Now, is that typical? Don't know. This is really the first site or set of sites anyone's found from this period. You know, it's early 17th century, first quarter of the 17th century. You know, this seemingly changes a bit later, although we do find a lot of reprocessed objects. But this is an important site for a number of reasons. And, you know, we originally categorized all this brass stuff as like scrap. And we began to realize this fall, once we really began to look at these, that no, a lot of this isn't scrap. They are making tools out of these, and they're not like half-finished tools. They're like fully formed. We don't know what they're used for. And one of the more typical objects, if you look at that object way on the right, it's sort of a half-rolled piece of scrap. We find a lot of those. And, you know, we thought originally they were tinkle cones, half-rolled beads. None of that works. The other thing we're seeing is these guys are masters of cuprous, manipulation of cuprous materials. They're making amazing things. We don't know exactly what they're used for, but they are. One of the things we just discovered is these scraps of brass, and until we started looking at them closely, we didn't really understand what they were. If you look here, they're all folded on the side, 3 sides, except this one. These are tools. Knives, scrapers, I don't know. Here's a couple more. Here's some of those half-rolled. Sorry about the quality of the photographs. And in one area, feature 36, we found what initially seemed to be beads. They're not beads. They're so tightly rolled, you could never get a string through them. And in that same area, we found all these little tips that are tightly rolled. They're tools, and we suspect these are breaking off of these, and we see these broken ends. What they are, we don't know. Now, we don't know if they exist in other 17th century sites because we just sort of discovered this. It's going to be definitely worth something to look at. It's just sort of an early 17th century phenomenon. The other thing we're finding is a lot of reprocessed iron objects. They are not taking a single iron object, except for that pot hook, and keeping it and using it, you know, as it was intended. All of the iron axes and objects are being reprocessed into traditional celt forms. Now here's a perfectly good mattock, and they're making an iron arrow point out of it. And other things too, a lot of rose head nails, knife fragments, scissors, and here's a mixed bag of other things from the site. You know, this is probably native made. Here's a reprocessed axe. Here's, you know, a reprocessed axe is made into a celt. Here's something for all you ceramic aficionados. I don't know if Luciana is looking at this, but our idea of ceramics in the 17th century is now wrong, completely wrong. You know, I had the idea that there's Shantok ware, you know, this castellated vessel with medallions, versus Hackney Pond ware, which is associated with Pequots. Well, at this site, we're finding both. I have no idea what this means. I don't know how significant it may or may not be, but we're finding these castellated vessels with medallions, which are classic, you know, signifiers of Shantok ware. And I always thought Shantok ware was post Pequot War. And we're finding, you know, Hackney Pond ware across all these domestic sites. So it's interesting what it might mean. Is it, you know, intermarriage, you know, Mohegan women coming in with Pequots and bringing their tradition? That sounds a little overly simplistic. I think it's more complicated, but it'll take some time to sort that one out. Here's other stuff, you know, a lot of glass beads. We're actually getting a couple of wampum beads as well. Interestingly, though, there's no evidence of wampum production. All of the shellfish from these middens are soft shell clam. There's one midden with a predominance of oyster and some other stuff, which is interesting because it suggests, you know, different decisions households are making about where they're going to harvest their, you know, their foods. And then finally, this is something that's really interesting. Thank God for Sarah Sportman. We wouldn't know any of this without her. So we had all these faunal remains in these middens, and of course I needed to find out what they were. So there's one particular household that has a pretty distinct faunal assemblage. If you look at this chart, everybody, it's pretty similar, you know, bird, you know, eel, shad, alewife, everything points to kind of a spring deal. Seal are probably spring too. But notice at the bottom, pig. So that's pretty interesting. Where are they getting pig? Well, they could have gotten them from trade from the Dutch, which means they're raising pig. But there's another context which I think might be more relevant, is there's a couple of primary sources that the Pequots took pig from Saybrook Fort in a raid and Weathersfield when they raided that. And they may well have brought them back. If that's the case, that's pretty interesting, obviously. The other thing that's interesting, and I didn't have a slide of this, but from that same context, midden context, we have a gun flint. So why is that a big deal? Well, the Pequots, according to the English, only had 16 guns during the war. Whoever this person was, he had one. He was on one of these raids. He's, you know, seemingly has, you know, differential, he has, you know, access to different kinds of foods. There's some other things too that are interesting, not a high concentration of graphite, but there's some other things that are kind of interesting, you know, the wampum, the graphite, which is, you know, traditionally associated with men on the battlefield from what we've been discovering in the gunflint. So is this person of different status, different rank than other people? You know, I think we have to wait until we see what comes out of some of these other middens, but it's intriguing and it's quite interesting. So there may be an opportunity here at this site to look at household variability, which may reflect differential status, maybe redistribution, we don't know yet. But the most important point I'm trying to make is there is, for the first time in my career, an opportunity to look at this stuff on a site that's, you know, completely intact, it's undisturbed, and has the material remains that may, you know, provide some information. So with that, I'm going to stop. And I guess if you can still hear me, we have time for some questions, Dave?
Yeah, Kevin, I think that we do. So first of all, let me say thank you, everyone, for sticking with us, but a big special thank you for Kevin for dealing with all those technical difficulties and not losing your stride at all during this presentation. I personally thought it was very good. There are a couple of questions in the Q&A already, Kevin.
Okay.
So I'll open up and read them to you. So hold on, we'll start.
I can see them, yeah.
You can see them? Okay. So the first one is by Clifford Neal.
Yep.
The Wangunk points in southeastern Connecticut burials. Might that indicate fighting in southeastern Connecticut or Pequot killed in Wangunk territory wars and brought back to southeastern Connecticut?
All right, so Cliff can hear me. I don't have to answer live or anything, right?
No, yeah, answer with your microphone.
Okay, so hey Cliff, how you doing? Glad you could join. You know, I'm assuming that because of that Dutch record, that these are either men killed in their wars against the Wangang. Remember, there were 3 battles. But it could also be the result of the Wangang participation in the Mistick battle and the Battle of English Withdrawal. So, you know, we do find a number of these, as I said, in remains of Pequot males and burials. But we also find them in the battlefield in some interesting contexts that suggest, hey, the Wangang are present. So I'd have to say both. I think the burials are probably, well, 2 of the burial, you know, I can't say. They could have been from the Wangang participation, or they could have been there. I think, can't tell, but I think the takeaway for me is that they're Wangang, and they are traditional enemies of the Pequot. And then Bill, hi Bill. You didn't know the monolithic axe came from Guildford. Yeah, but there's a very big association. You know, I shouldn't say associated with the Pequot. The reason I say that is my bias. The reason they call that Sachem's Head is they chased a band of Pequots down there where this thing was found. They try to get them to, you know, talk about where other communities were found, and they didn't, and they executed them. So I just, you know, in my mind, in my bias, it's associated with the Pequot, because I'm pushing the envelope here that the Quinnipiac are not sort of an emerging, chiefdom. The Pequots are, but it could be wrong. So take that with a grain of salt. And then Scott, how you doing, Scott? Miss you. Hope you're around soon. Let me see. Any speculation on the changing social political organization reflecting some of these next sites relates to family organizations, spirituality? Yes, all the above. We just don't know much at this point, and we are looking at gendered space, and think we're seeing it, but we have not yet really looked at the close examination of the distribution of objects. You know, we had the first objects from those first 2 features, feature 1 and 2, but now we have a lot more data. We have a complete array of objects from the site, almost 100%. And now we're beginning to look at some of these issues. But that's why one of the important aspects of this year's field season will be identifying structures. You know, what's going on inside and outside the structures, and do we see differences between structures that might indicate status, organization. You know, those 2 lines of structures are really interesting. They're definitely, there's a pattern there. Purposeful pattern of separation. What do those mean? Lineages, families, don't know. So all those questions are exactly what we want to begin to pursue. So Akia, hi Akia. Any speculation on a changing social, political, military organization reflecting assemblages? It's too early, I think, but we're thinking about it. And when we're talking about changes, we're talking about temporal context. And a lot of this is the ability of us to seriate these 17th century sites that exist in a 23-year time frame into at least first half, second half. That is beyond challenging. The radiocarbonates don't tell us anything. They're all contemporaneous. But can we tell from the predominance of, you know, Dutch or English material culture? One thing we're doing, one of my students is working on right now, is sort of looking at the chemical and general material composition of these brass objects to see, the signatures, and initially to see what color they are. This could be important too, as you would recognize, red versus yellow versus red yellow. What are there certain kinds of colors associated with certain uses of objects? We can now see that. We're just getting started on that. But is there also a way to see signatures that might be Dutch or English? I'm holding my breath on that. I don't know if we'll get there. And then Clifford again. Is it kind of odd that the person of Calluna Hill is high status? Why wouldn't he reside at one of the major fort villages? I think any of these Pequot, 26 Pequot villages have a sachem. He's the head of the family. He's the head of the lineage. So I would expect high status people, if my argument works, at any of these domestic villages or sites. The question is now, if you follow that argument, there's a hierarchy. So to what extent is this person, of higher rank or status than the sachem from another village? I don't want to dwell on the gunflints, but there's only 16 guns the Pequots had based upon English sources. He's got one. Is that meaningful? He's also the guy with the pig. There's some other stuff going on there. So, now the question is, we need to look at this at these other domestic sites and villages to see if we see evidence of this. So this particular site is providing us as a kind of a baseline to measure against other sites. And then Scott, again, is there any thought the number of the tool forms you're seeing are a result of using your materials in place of pre-contact materials? That's the question. So one thing we notice, lithics just fall out. No lithics in these sites to speak of. There might be some, but compared to a late woodland village of comparable size, no lithics. So they are quickly replacing, I think, these traditional tool forms that we see in the lithic assemblages with modifications of reprocessed brass and iron objects. So I think they are a replacement, but it's so interesting to me that, and we didn't recognize this before, and it could just be because, I'm stupid, but I haven't seen this, and it could be because we haven't looked at it. The range of tool forms here that we finally noticed is pretty amazing. They don't seem to, this is not a great statement, but they don't seem to carry through per se, although comparing it to some of the, third quarter 17th century Pequot sites we worked on, some forms do. But the general sense I get is these forms are maybe unique to an early period until they begin to be replaced by more formal European introduced tools. But just the range of tools is quite remarkable, I think, that I did not anticipate. We were lucky to notice. And we thought they were all beads at first, until we started looking at everything under a microscope, and we noticed they're all closed. There's no freaking way in hell these things were beads. And they're all broken at the ends, and they're all found in the same place, and there's all tips in the same place. So I think they're tools. Also, lots of castellations on Hollister native trim. Yep. So that's Shantok ware. I did not expect it in a Pequot War Era site. Dead wrong. I got to talk to Lucienne about this. This is pretty interesting. I have no idea what it means, but it's potentially, I think, pretty important, pretty significant. Jay. Have the rolled brass been tested for tobacco? Could they be pipe stems? No, there's absolutely no hole. There's no hole in these things. They are rolled so tight. Now, we have found brass pipes on the battlefield as part of the assemblage native men are carrying. Those traditional, brass pipes you see in their coin sites and elsewhere, although we haven't tested it. But these things are not stems. There's just no opening. They are rolled so tight that I think they're rolled that tight for structural integrity, as are the tips that seem to be broken off. Clifford's wondering if there's a signature associated with pre-smallpox and post-contact epidemic indicates. That would be pretty interesting. So in theory, this is a post-smallpox epidemic site. We know it was burned on May 26, 1637. The other Pequot sites, we don't know. The radiocarbonates aren't going to tell us pre or post epidemic, and maybe at some point the objects will. We do think that one of the sites, a very large site, was contemporaneous with the battle, although abandoned, but I won't get into the details on that. But that's the key, Clifford, is to see if we can eventually seriate these sites for a number of reasons. And Bill, do you feel strongly that all the houses at Calluna are contemporaneous? I do, but you got to be careful with that. What's the evidence for contemporaneity? The radiocarbonates don't help. They're all within, plus or minus 10 or 20 years. But the linear arrangement, the fact there's no overlap, the fact that Mason says several wigwams are burned, the fact the material culture is virtually identical, suggests to me that, it's just such a highly organized place. I think they're all contemporaneous. But will we ever be able to demonstrate that to everyone's satisfaction? Probably not, but I have a number of circumstantial arguments I can give. And was the high status individuals a pipe smoker? Don't know. By the way, there's pipes in all of these households that we've investigated. So, and we know from burial context that at least from the mid to late 17th century, that pipes are associated with males. So that might be a key to looking at gendered space. We did find a really interesting steatite pipe at one of the domestic sites. Those are the ones that are being made and traded by Narragansett. Is that high status? I don't know. Status thing is very tricky, very tricky.
Yeah, Kevin, this is fascinating. I wonder, with some of those brass tools, if you think that, clearly they're taking the place of or supplanting lithic technology. And I wonder, so you've got those large sheets of brass or larger sheets that you think are cutting and scraping, and they look like they've been preferentially backed, right?
And smaller ones. We have smaller ones just like that.
Yeah. But the same thing with those copper, not beads, but copper rolled things. I wonder if those could be punches or awls of some kind,
They're definitely made to pierce. If you saw these things, and under a microscope, they're clearly rolled. They're not scrap. And they're sharp, but they may be also pretty delicate. But that's my guess. They're used for punching things.
Yeah, punching through maybe harder materials too. Like if there's an increase in sort of warfare, maybe punching through materials that are necessary for armament or something like that. I don't know.
Possible. That's what those conical points are for.
Yeah.
That's an interesting.
I mean for clothing, the clothing that they might be
for clothing
for war.
Yeah, whatever they're being used for, I agree with you. I think it's piercing. Now it's a matter of, I mean, these things have patina, they're corroded. Can we see use wear? I don't know. But what's interesting to me is they're mostly found in one household. So that's also what gets me thinking about specialization.
Sure. And Ernie wants to ask a question, so I'm going to promote him to panelist right now.
All right, Ernie.
There we go. Should be working.
Can you hear us?
Yep.
I hear you, Dawn.
Hi. Hi, Kevin.
Hey, Dawn.
I'm right behind. One comment and then a question. Is it possible that the pigs could have been hunted at that time? I seem to recall many disputes between native peoples and the English because the English let their hogs go wild. Possibly. But I was thinking in terms of the linear structures, have you tried any bone refits between these structures that might indicate lineages or family groups?
Great comment. Good question. We have just begun the analysis of this stuff, and one of the things we are looking for is refits, not only faunal, but also other material culture as well. As far as the pigs, there's no settlers here in 1637. The closest place you can get a pig is Saybrook or the Connecticut Valley settlements. That doesn't mean, however, that the Dutch didn't trade them, right? Or maybe even the English, who knows? So I can't, again, my bias is, raid, so the key to this will be to see if where, when, and if we find pig remains, not only in other households in that same site, but what about other, other sites that are roughly contemporaneous? We have 6 of them, although we haven't really found the middens yet, although we do have some food remains. But those are good questions. I mean, this is why we have a pretty unique opportunity here. If we can continue this, long term.
Is it possible that looking at the features and the faunal remains, features 1 and 2 seem to have an awful lot of large mammal and ducks. Features 37 and 38 seem to be the opposite, much smaller numbers of large mammals, a lot of smaller mammals. Could this be seasonality or just the randomness of the hunt?
Well, that's the question. So in terms of seasonality, we're thinking this is, we know the site was abandoned on May 26, 1637. How long was it occupied before that? One of the interesting things is the botanical assemblage, which is, aside from storable corn, beans, and hickory nuts, virtually no bots. So to me, that might indicate, they're not there in the fall, harvesting and, or consuming. So, and the middens are really thin. I mean, phenomenally thin. So we don't think they were there that long, but obviously they were there long enough to accumulate quite a range. I mean, look at the fauna remains there. There's some commonality, bird, fish, and they're only 2 miles from where you can get shellfish and fish. Most of the fish seem to be anadromous. That might be suggestive. Seal, we're still trying to figure out if they're, is that a winter thing into early spring or is that year round? But the seasonality, we think, supports a sort of early spring. The thinness of the midden suggests, not more than a 2-month occupation, but you know how that goes. we need to look at that really, really carefully. And the other thing we're looking at because of this is this a wartime settlement ship? You know, the site is situated between the two forts. Is this a common part of a Pequot settlement system move? You know, we don't know. We've got to investigate those other sites. Is this unique? There's just a lot of questions. But the fact that we can address these questions to me is, you know, amazing.
Okay, well, I think I don't see any other questions. Once again, Kevin, thanks for being a. Oh wait, sorry, Ernie's got another question.
No. We were just saying thank you.
Don't just saying bye. Yeah, thank you all for you know, bearing with me on this. This is going to take a lot of thought for me to like figure this out.
But thanks for being such a good sport, Kevin, with all the technical difficulties too.
Oh,
So.
believe me, I went through this all semester.
Oh, my heart goes out to you, Kevin.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, thank you all. I really appreciate it.
We'll do the same thing again next week. Hopefully we'll have some of the technical difficulties worked out by then. Thanks again, Kevin, and we will see you all next week when Nick will be giving a talk, and so the tomb remains.